Hello and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and joining me here in the Murrieta studios is Dr. David Burns. Hi, David.
Hi, Fabrice.
Dr. David Burns has been a pioneer in the development of cognitive therapy, and he is the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 20 languages. He is an emeritus adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Today is Feeling Good podcast, episode 33. We are continuing with our live session recording and commentary with Mark. Before we get into the heart of the matter, you have a few announcements. And if our listeners are listening to the podcast as it is published, there are some upcoming workshops that you're going to be doing.
Right. Later this month, on April 24 and 25, 2017,
yeah.
I'll be in McLean, Virginia, for a 2-day conference on new high-speed treatment techniques for trauma, treating depression and anxiety in trauma patients. And that workshop is a really cool one. Features a live demonstration with a volunteer from the audience on the evening of day one. I'll give the same workshop the next 2 days, April 26th and 27th in Newark, New Jersey.
Yeah.
And then the next 2 days, April 28 and 29, I'll be offering the same 2-day workshop in Philadelphia. If you're interested in attending one of these workshops, you can dial IAHP, that's the sponsor, at 800-258-8411. That's 800-258-8411. Now, these are training programs for mental health professionals who want to learn these new high-speed team CBT techniques. However, sometimes general public types do sneak into my workshops. I know one already who attended in Boston, and he became the live volunteer. He was just fantastic. And so if you're not a therapist but have a serious interest in this topic, you might consider registering. One other quick announcement. On May 7th, 2017, I'll be giving a keynote address at the California Association for Marriage and Family Therapy here in Santa Clara, California. And that'll be 2 back-to-back 2-hour presentations. It'll be a lecture showing a video of a woman I described actually in the article for Psychotherapy Networker that was in the March-April issue. The woman who had decades of rape and violence, domestic violence, and her recovery was quite rapid. And the topic of that, the title, I can't remember the title, but the topic is Healing Yourself for mental health professionals, because the woman I treated, that I'll show the video, was a mental health professional who had endured, decades of horrific depression and anxiety and shame, and you see her miraculous transformation in a single therapy session.
Yeah.
And then the second part of that keynote address, I'll be doing healing for the members of the audience, showing them how to use these techniques. And so if you're interested in that one, you can contact at the CAMFT, California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists, Nancy Milazzo. If you'd like to register or get information, 858-292-2638. That's 858-292-2638. And you can also always find these and other upcoming workshops posted on my website.
Of course, yes.
Feelinggood.com.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you for the announcements. I'm sure that this will be of interest to a number of people who are listening to the podcast. So on to today's episode. We finished in the last episode the agenda setting phase, and we're moving into the methods. The client is primed and ready and willing to do the work. And so you're going to be working from the daily mood log that he completed. In fact, in this phase, you might even be adding some things to it. And And once Mark identifies one of the thoughts that he wants to work with first in there, you do a recovery circle, right?
Yeah.
You want to say something about the recovery circle and what it's used for?
Well, when you hear the podcast, I always ask the patient, what thought do you want to work on first? And you'll recall he had a number of thoughts that, I'm a failure, I've been a failure as a father, something, a lot of us can identify with, this feeling that we failed in some aspect of our lives. But the thought number 2 was the one he wanted to tackle first, where he was telling himself, there's something defective in my brain that has prevented me from having a loving relationship with my son. And he believed that 90%, which means he's pretty certain that's true. And this feeling of defectiveness is common in depression. You may express it differently, but I would say most people who are depressed feel that they're defective, inferior, worthless, that there's somehow something wrong with you. So I think you'll enjoy hearing how we attack that thought.
And that's the one he put in the recovery circle.
Yeah, and a recovery circle, it's a big circle, and you'll see it posted with the show notes.
Yeah.
And it has a lot of arrows going from it. And you think of the recovery circle as a trap he's in. As long as he believes that thought in the middle of the circle, he's going to feel miserable. And any listeners now who have told themselves, I should be better than I am, I'm defective, I'm worthless, I'm inferior, I've screwed up. And who of us hasn't felt that way during our moments of self-doubt and despair? And as long as he believes that, he's going to have all of these negative feelings that he's been talking about, the depression, the sadness, the shame, the hopelessness, and all of that. And the moment he stops believing that thought, there will be an instantaneous change in his feelings.
Yeah.
But you can't just tell someone think positively. You can't try to cheer someone up because that will just make them more irritated and upset. It's not that simple. We've got to find ways to reveal to Mark that this is a false thought. And so we need a lot of ideas of how to do that. And so there's arrows coming out of the recovery circle, and each arrow represents a different technique we could use from my list of 50 basic cognitive, behavioral, and team therapy techniques.
Yeah.
And the first 4 are always the same. Empathy, agenda setting, identify the distortions, and then the straightforward technique. So you'll see those printed out on the recovery circle.
Yeah, and empathy and agenda setting, we've already applied this
exactly.
in the first
right. And so the next thing
that
we'll do, which you'll hear in the podcast, is identify the distortions. When we get to the live portion of the podcast, when we'll ask Mark to identify the distortions in those thoughts, we'll pause the podcast, and you, the listener, can look at the list of 10 distortions that I'll publish with the show notes and see how many distortions you can find in that thought. I think you'll find it challenging and pretty gratifying and intriguing to see how many distortions you can find. And then once you're done, turn the podcast back on. You'll hear us working with Mark as he identifies the distortions in those thoughts. And then after we've done that, Jill and I will select 15 or 20 additional techniques that will add to that recovery circle that we can use to help Mark challenge that thought, because you never know what technique is going to work, and we might try 5 techniques that aren't effective, and he'll still believe that there's some defect in his brain, and then maybe technique number 6, he'll suddenly have an aha moment, discover that that's not true, and why that's not true, and then experience a sudden relief. So that's the purpose of the recovery circle. Some schools of therapy get all hung up on this one thing you're supposed to do to cure people. Yeah. Like we've talked about it before with psychoanalysis, it was free association. Or if you're a behavior therapist, you might treat everyone with exposure.
Yeah.
Or if you're an EMDR therapist, you'll try EMDR. Everyone has this one thing.
It's just like one tool, yeah.
But in team therapy, we use tools, 50, 100 tools derived from 10 or 15 different schools of therapy, because you never know what technique is going to change a person's life.
Yeah, hence the recovery circle. In fact, I know that the ones that you usually hand out, there's 18 arrows on one side, and then you can flip it over, and then you can put even more techniques if you want to.
Yeah, you could choose up to 30 or more techniques to challenge.
Although I don't know if you ever got to that many techniques to try.
Well, in the early days, before I had paradoxical agenda setting, I once had a patient who had the thought that she'd murdered her baby.
Yeah.
Because of an abortion. I think we talked about her in an earlier podcast. And
yeah.
This was before I had all the cool agenda setting techniques we have today. But it took over 100 techniques before I found the one that worked for her.
Yeah.
And then she suddenly had a complete and total elimination of her symptoms. But we used to need a lot more techniques than we need now. But it's still good to have a full toolkit to help each patient.
Wonderful. So we'll hear Jill's take on the methods phase that I recorded in her interview, and then we'll move on to the session itself. So Jill, you started also with a sort of a recovery circle. We'll have a sample on the show notes. Mm-hmm. You didn't actually do a formal one, but essentially that's what you did with your notes. And you started with the paradoxical double standard technique. Mm-hmm. How did you decide to use that first?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know.
I shouldn't say first because you did the identification of the distortion.
We did, that's right. We did. The first method we used was identify the distortions. And then we made a list of, as David said, something like 12 or 15 methods, and we could have come up with even more, and we kind of talked about them and shared them with Mark, which is exactly what I would do with a patient as well. And then we decided to use the paradoxical double standard. My own feeling, David and I didn't talk about it out loud. I oftentimes think of the paradoxical double standard as a wonderful method to use with someone that I know experiences compassion toward other people, but is struggling with having compassion toward the self. It wouldn't be an especially effective method if you're working with a patient who's equally critical of everyone else in his life. But I had the sense from talking to Mark.
Not so good for a narcissist.
Exactly. It's really not, because you'll discover they don't have a double standard, right? They're criticizing everyone else as much as they're criticizing themselves, or more than. But in the case of Mark, he came across as having such a warm heart and being such a loving person and giving everyone else in his life the benefit of the doubt. And so it seemed like a great method to kind of capitalize on his empathy toward other people, and then you try to kind of turn that around and have the patient use that same compassion they experience toward others toward themselves.
Now, Jill, it seemed that for some reason the methods, as you got into them, worked rather quickly. I mean, I was surprised myself. I mean, I've seen you and David do some great work. It just was striking to me. What do you attribute that quick change to?
Yeah, I mean, I think my experience is that since working with David and taking our time and working through the model, as you said, we used a lot of time doing empathy and having Mark feel really heard and understood. And then we spent a lot of time on what we call paradoxical agenda setting and listing all of these advantages. And Mark, in a way, was even feeling a little better after that. There's some sort of mood elevating effect, I think, of listing all of the advantages of your symptoms and feeling almost kind of proud of your symptoms. And I think once you've set the stage well and moved slowly and methodically through the steps, that by the time that you get to methods, quite often they do work dramatically and quickly, because Mark was, ready to roll. He was motivated. He was kind of right on track with us and seemed just eager to defeat all of his negative thoughts. And I think it's that motivation and energy that makes a big difference.
Yeah, I think that you really dealt a blow to the negative thoughts with the double standard. So let's listen now to Mark's session.
Mm-hmm. Let's dive in here, and we've got 4 negative thoughts. I'll just read them out loud to get the listeners back on track with us. We've got negative thoughts, distortions, and positive thoughts. We're going to try to come up with positive thoughts that will crush these negative thoughts. But first negative thoughts, I've been a failure, 70%. Number two, there is something defective in my brain that prevents me from developing a close relationship with my son, 90%. Someone else could have had a better connection with Jill and David this morning, 70%. And this shouldn't happen to me because I am a caring person, 75%. And are there any other negative thoughts that you'd want to add to that list? I mean, that's a great list right there, so we don't need more, but if there's anything else that jumps out.
Again, like you said, later this evening, I'm going to remember quite a few other negative thoughts about this issue. Part of it, I don't know if this is even a negative thought or not. Part of this failure is the fault of other people who have been involved in our lives.
Yeah.
I don't know if...
And who are those other people? You mean the government? And
no, actually, the close family.
Yeah.
You're saying that your poor relationship with your son is also...
was augmented, was... really exacerbated, hurt by relatives that we had around us on that other end of the world.
Yeah, so add that other family members
contributed.
Contributed to my conflict with my son. You're not talking about an ex-spouse or something, are you?
Yes.
Okay. That makes it a little clearer.
Right. It seemed a little vague. Right.
Yeah.
And ex-wife.
Right.
Huge family.
Right. Okay, that helps us to put more meat on the bones, right?
Yeah.
Like my ex-wife and her family kind of interfered in my relationship with my son.
Yes. I'm sorry that I'm blaming, but it just produced a toxic environment.
Well, I'm sure that's true. How much do you believe that's at 100?
That is, I'm blaming others, probably something like a good part of failure goes to me. That's a big one. That's an 80.
An 80. Great. Now, which of these thoughts would you like to work on first? We've got five good ones.
This one, actually, that I'm giving it the highest score as well, is there is something defective in my brain that prevents me from having relationships.
Okay, and you believe that one 90%.
Yes.
Now, the first technique we always use is identify the distortions. And let me give you another daily mood log with the distortions on the back, and let's see if we can find some distortions in that thought. And we'll write them down using abbreviations here in the distortion column. Something defective in my brain that prevents me from having a relationship with my son, right?
Correct.
All right, so at this point, we encourage you to pause your recording and do the work for yourself on paper to find out what distortions are in Mark's thought. And David, can you remind us what the thought is?
There's something defective in my brain that prevents me from having a loving relationship with my son. And if you're not driving, and if you're home or at your office, grab a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil and look at the 10 distortions on the website and see how many distortions you can find in that thought. I think you'll discover it's quite illuminating and in some ways kind of a fun process.
All right, so let's do that. Okay, good. So we hope that you paused the tape and found all kinds of distortions. And before we restart the session, David, you wanted to mention that there's one distortion that
I think
Mark did not find in the session.
Yes, because I don't have it written down here. on his daily mood log, and the first distortion, if you selected all or nothing thinking, there's many others you're going to hear about when we start the recording, but if you had selected all or nothing thinking, I would have to say that's a good, positive, correct response on your part, because he's talking about our brains are either perfect or terrible, I'm defective or I'm whole, whereas we're in between 0 and 100% in all kinds of dimensions. We have all kinds of defects. And so his thinking could easily be argued to be an example of all or nothing thinking.
Right. So great. So let's see what Mark did with this.
I think one of them is overgeneralization.
I love that. So put OG there. And explain to us why that is, because that's a great call.
Because I'm taking the example of my relationship, or lack thereof, with my son, and saying that, and truly believing that there is a defect in my brain that I was even born with, and I still carry that big hole in my head.
So you're generalizing from the conflict with your son to a defect in yourself.
Correct.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. Rather than saying, I'm having trouble connecting with him, I need to use more I feel statements, and there will be some limits here, but somehow I'm this bad, defective person, and that is right there, in a nutshell, an awful high percentage of all human suffering is based on that mental error of overgeneralization. What are some others that you see?
Also, mental filter, in my opinion. Seems like I'm ignoring everything else in my mind, my brain,
my relationships,
going through life, co-workers, you name it, patients and so forth, that I'm not taking into account.
You're focusing only on the negative.
Heavily focusing on this failure.
And ignoring all of this other data that you have.
Yeah, and I call it being humble about it, but it is, it's not based on reality.
Yeah.
It's not balanced.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Great.
Could we then, by the same token, add discounting the positive?
Yes.
DP?
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. That's what I habitually do. Yes.
Dwelling on the negatives and ignoring the positives.
Yes. Yeah. And jumping to conclusion that all of this is because of a defect in my brain, and if it wasn't so, I would have had the most beautiful relationship with my son and everybody else.
So put JC, jumping to conclusions. And could we also add, and maybe I'm jumping the gun too much, but you're kind of inspiring me here, would it also be a hidden should statement?
Oh, definitely.
What is the hidden should?
Actually, one of them is this should not have happened to me.
Yeah.
The other one is I should have been born with a better brain.
Yes, and humans should have wonderful relationships with everybody.
Yes, everybody has to.
And we shouldn't have conflicts in our family.
Right.
Yes, isn't that the fact?
Put SH here.
So this is a should statement.
Yeah. It's multiple should statements.
Yes.
What else is
Yes. And even though I did not mention, there is also some fortune telling. I think I did mention that, maybe I didn't, that this is just how it is, and I'm going to live with this for the rest of my life.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. So you put FT for fortune telling.
And there's magnification and minimization. I don't know about this particular relationship with my son. I'm totally minimizing, filtering out all the good times that we have had together.
And also all the ways you've related to patients, to Tuesday group people, to friends, to your colleagues.
Correct.
Right?
Yes. There's a significant proportion, even only if I talk about
your
my son.
So there actually have been positive
decades
moments
of,
you've had.
Oh my God, beautiful moments. Yes.
We should
I'm
all have
surprised to hear
relationships.
that. Maybe you could teach us how to have better relationships.
Well, the trouble is that he was younger then.
Yeah.
Oh, then it doesn't count.
then teenage happened.
Oh, right. Right. That
Right.
damn
Yeah.
adolescence.
So add MAGMIN, magnification
Yeah.
and minimization.
That's really cool to hear, Mark, though, because I kind of had no idea till you saw that distortion and shared that with us that there would have ever been anything positive between the two of you.
Can I give a quick vignette?
Sure.
No, David, shut up.
Right.
Fabrice is getting the thumbs down. Let Jill take over. Shut up, David. This is a real quickie, but when you get depressed, and because this will relate to a lot of people who are hearing the podcast and therapists as well, there is a tendency to overlook all kinds of positive things and to just hypnotize yourself into thinking things are totally negative, just as you're explaining that you had these wonderful times with him growing up. And I had a patient once who came to me for treatment in Philadelphia, and he said that he'd been depressed every minute of his life, and he'd never had one happy moment. And he said he was truly a hopeless case. And so I thought, boy, this guy will be really, really tough. He's just never even had one happy moment. And so I worked with him, and he was pretty easy to treat, actually, and he responded in about 8 or 10 sessions or something, which was fast in those days. And these days it wouldn't seem fast anymore. But and then I told him, I said, and then he just became joyous. He had this tremendous change within a session. And at the end I said, gosh, it must be wonderful for you, having joy and happiness for the first time in your life. And he says, what are you talking about? And I said, well, you told me you've never had one happy moment in your life. He said, oh, no, that wasn't right. I've been depressed for a month, but I was happy all the time before that. But he had just completely shut that out of his mind.
Wow.
I believe that.
Any other distortions?
Probably emotional reasoning that I feel worthless and inferior, inadequate.
And defective.
So
I must be defective.
Yes,
I must be worthless.
That's correct.
I must have poor communication skills because I feel like I don't know how to get close to people.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. Anything else?
I'm going to just write that down as well.
Oh, yeah.
We talked about should statements. I'm not sure if labeling, other than labeling myself. Yeah, well, that's a big one.
Right,
I'm a defective person.
Right, it's like you're wearing a necklace that says, broken brain.
Defective brain inside. We could get a hat that you could wear that says defective brain under this hat.
And I'm surprised at how not everybody can see that. As soon as they say, they should see that.
Well, I saw that about you right away when we first met.
Right, but you're putting that label on yourself rather than focusing on the specifics. I think
rather
David
than saying I'm having a conflict with your son, you're saying I'm a defective person with a defective brain. Isn't that interesting?
Yes, it is.
And it's so powerful and persuasive that we hypnotize ourselves like that, to think that like that.
Yeah, I'm still thinking that way.
Yeah.
I'm not convinced.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Very seductive. And any other?
Self-blame, as you can see, circumstances, family dynamics.
Yeah, right. So you put SB and OB here. So we'll go on, and should we just take a minute and share with the little, which we wouldn't on paper, but some of the techniques we're now going to use, the ones we would be considering using.
Sure.
Because the idea is there's a necessary and sufficient condition for emotional upset, and there's a necessary and sufficient condition for emotional change. The necessary and sufficient condition to be upset is to have a negative thought and believe it. So here you're saying there's something defective in my brain that prevents me from having a relationship with my son, and you believe that 90.
Correct.
In order to get out of these negative feelings, we have to come up with a positive thought that has two characteristics. It has to be totally true, 100% true, and then it has to crush the negative thought. In other words, drastically lower the belief in that negative thought. And so we may need a variety of techniques to bring this change about, but when the change happens, it'll generally happen very rapidly. It'll be a kind of a sudden thing. The moment you kind of find a way to crush or defeat this negative thought, then things will suddenly shift. So we could be thinking about, let's just brainstorm together.
So we're going to brainstorm possible methods that we could use to help Mark with
Yeah.
this negative thought, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So should I just kind of share with you some thoughts I have?
Yeah, we can kind
what
of
do we
take
wanna
turns brainstorming type of
Okay.
thing. You get us started with
So
a
actually
few.
from the very outset, even after I asked Mark that question during the empathy phase, I actually thought the method reattribution could be useful to Mark.
Oh, I hadn't thought of that one. And let's see. Fabrice is saying he can upload a mock recovery circle. Yeah, we'll create one and upload it on the notes, the show notes. Another one I'm thinking about would be paradoxical double standard technique.
Absolutely.
But would Mark say this to a dear friend who was just like him?
Absolutely.
Your turn.
Externalization of voices. So that would be the method where we'd invite Mark to talk back to his negative thoughts and kind of take turns if he gets stuck, helping him to challenge his negative thoughts.
And that also goes hand in hand with the acceptance paradox.
Right.
So we'll probably model both
Sure.
of those.
And what about shades of gray?
Oh, I love that. That's great. That's for all or nothing thinking.
Right.
And then I'm thinking about examine the evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Your turn.
Okay, we could do the semantic technique since there were a number of should statements.
And also labeling myself as defective is another semantic.
Right, absolutely.
Semantic thing.
Absolutely. Oh, and what always goes with that then would be specific.
Oh,
right.
That's a good point. I forgot about that. That's huge. And we could do any of the uncovering techniques: individual downward arrow, interpersonal downward arrow.
Right. We could do let's define terms.
Oh,
since
yeah.
That's a good one for labeling as well.
Yeah. And then we could do 5 secrets of effective communication as an example of be specific. What would be a particular kind of interaction with your son? Mm-hmm. What did he say? What did you say next? How could that be improved?
Right. So use the relationship journal to kind of highlight difficulties in your communication with your son and work with you on revising your communication.
Yeah. Well, I thought of another one. Cost-benefit analysis.
Absolutely.
Kind of similar to paradoxical agenda setting, but what we did. But what are some advantages of beating up on yourself like this? What are some disadvantages?
Definitely. Yep.
So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and we could add another 5 or 10, but this is probably more than enough.
I think so.
And the main teaching point here is why are we coming up with a variety of techniques to help Mark crush this thought?
Because we don't actually know which method is going to be helpful to Mark, and so number one, we want to list a number of methods and kind of be open to trying a number of different methods. And also, I think it gives Mark and any patient a sense of hope when you make a list and recognize that there really are so many different options we could take. We've got a lot of different directions, and so we don't need to be too worried about whether the first one works or the second one works because we have a lot of options.
Yeah, in fact, we want the old expression I used to use before we had paradoxical agenda setting so well developed, which causes now faster recovery in most cases, but was fail as fast as you can, because let's say the 8th technique, bang, you suddenly crush this thing, and you have this kind of aha moment. Well, if we could fail every minute, try a new technique, like really high-speed colossal failure, then we could get to the technique that works in 8 minutes, rather than 8 months or several years of slow progress. So, what should we start out with? A gentle thing like paradoxical double standard? He's very compassionate. We could jump right in with something crushingly aggressive like externalization of voices, or what's your inclination? Would you like to start gentle, start aggressive? Any preference?
Yeah, like you said, I don't know which whichever you choose, whichever technique you feel like is going to get us.
We could start with the double standard and then move on to externalization of voices.
That's what I was going to vote for.
Okay.
I think that's a good way to start.
Why don't you take over here, Jill?
Okay. So I just need to have I just also want to know the exact negative thought in front of me. So we're working on this one. There's something defective in my brain that is preventing me from having a close relationship with my son, right?
That's a big one, yes.
Okay. And that's the one you wanted to start with.
That's a good one. Yes,
yeah.
Thank you.
So, Mark, we're going to try a method then that's called the paradoxical double standard. And actually, it reminds me that there are a number of different ways to do it. I was going to set it up as being the... okay. Yeah. So, Mark, this is a role play method. So I'm going to actually play the role of a dear friend of yours.
Okay.
Someone that you really care about and feel compassionate toward. I don't want you to picture a particular friend, but just someone that you can imagine feeling really close to and compassionate towards. But the thing is that I'm not just a friend of yours. I'm kind of a friend/clone. So in this role play, I'm going to be just like you, Mark. So I'm going to have had the same life experiences that you had, grew up in the same place. I also have a son that I'm really feeling down about not being close enough to. I also, rescued my family from
political oppression.
From political oppression and have kind of moved to safety. But, I'm really feeling awful and sad and ashamed and guilty about the fact that my son and I don't have a close relationship. So I've tried for years and years and years. He's 40 years old, and all I've ever, really wanted other than having a satisfying career is to have a really close and warm and connected family. And yet I've tried and I'm still not feeling close to my son. And in this role play, Mark, I'm just going to you're going to be Mark, and I'm just going to be a dear friend of yours. You can maybe call me Joe. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. So, Mark, would you be willing to, I'm gonna take over now as Joe, and Mark, I'm wondering, would you be willing to talk to me a little bit? I've been feeling kind of down, and I wondered if you'd be willing to share your thoughts on what I'm struggling with me.
Yeah, I would be happy to do that.
Yeah. So, Mark, I told you I'm having this awful feelings of sadness and guilt and inadequacy around this relationship with my son. And I just keep telling myself that there's something defective in my brain that's preventing me from having a close relationship with my son, that this problem with my son is all my fault. And do you think that it's all my fault and that my brain is just defective and that's why I can't be close to him?
I'm not really sure that is true. I'm thinking about a few things, and short of doing a brain MRI, I understand that you are around a bunch of people who are experts in psychology. You have told me that you have actually had very extensive sessions with psychologists before, and you probably have mentioned this to all of these people who are supposedly experts.
Absolutely. I've been working on it for years.
Yeah, and you have not told me that anyone besides yourself ever said, Mark, or Joe, by the way, you may have a defect in your brain,
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, Mark. That's true. I do have a bunch of friends and colleagues who know me really well and I've shared this with, and I guess you're right. No one else has said that I have a defect in my brain. But do you think it's possible? I mean, not possible, but do you think it's likely though that it is really my fault? I mean, we're not as close as I'd like to be, and so don't you think that that's all my fault?
It's really hard to argue that it is all your fault. You may have a role in it, but to to blame it 100% on your own brain defect really is unfair, because of the evidence of being with all of these professionals and being all of these friends and people who are close to you. And I've never heard from you that you say, so-and-so told me that you had a brain defect.
But isn't it, if I can also be...
Yeah, I've got Joe. This twin clone Mark over here, too.
Yeah, Mark.
Sorry, Joe.
Yeah,
Joe, I'm Joe.
Yes.
But those mental health professionals, they probably realized I had a brain defect, but just didn't want to say it for fear of, hurting my feelings.
I doubt it very much. No. And so many encounters for so long, somebody would have said something. That doesn't sound right. No. I don't think so.
Are you just saying that because you're trying to be nice to me, or do you really believe that it's probably not true that I've got this brain defect?
I cannot make a case that I just don't see the proof that you have a brain defect, Joe.
And let me just ask you a question. How much do you believe what you just said? There's no proof that you have a...
Very close to 100%.
Okay, what could we write this here? There's no real proof that I have a brain defect, and no expert has ever suggested that I have a brain defect.
Yes.
Defect, comma, although it's true that I'm not as close to my son as I would like to be. And how much do you believe this statement?
I think it's...
Right. Now, how much
100%.
do you believe this statement? You're 100% on this positive thought. How much now do you believe I have a brain defect?
It doesn't jive. These don't jive. I truly believe that. Now, this is a lifelong belief.
Right.
Or at least, 20, 30-year long belief.
Yeah. So how much you believe in that right now?
There's really not much room for that.
No.
No.
So what would you give it?
I think eventually I have to give up on that.
Okay.
Reluctantly. Read this one more time. What's the positive thought that you came up with from this exercise?
There is no real proof, despite ample opportunity for it. But there has not been ever a proof that I have a brain defect. And no expert has told me that I have a brain defect. Even when I have gone to them for help, they never said, by the way. Even though I don't have a good relationship with my son.
Yes. And could we add say, of course I do have many defects.
Yes, that's very true.
That's David's kind of sneaking in a little acceptance paradox here, right? That there's a lot of this statement that is untrue, like the part of it that's saying I have this brain defect and that's why I don't have a close relationship with my son, but that we're also hanging out, like sticking with this theme of humility and saying, but look, I'm not perfect. I have plenty of defects here too.
Yeah,
right?
Is there a difference between saying I'm a defective human being,
right?
Then I have some
versus I have many defects as a human being. Yes. I'm a human being with defects.
Yes.
Is that different?
I totally see the difference. Yes.
Yeah.
So for me, the belief was absolute.
Yeah, right. So should we now...
But you're saying it's not possible to believe both of these things. So
Correct.
If you have this new belief that says it's not a brain defect and all these fantastic experts who've met with me don't think it's a brain defect, then I can no longer actually sit here and believe that it's a brain defect.
Yeah.
Right?
Correct. Very true. Yeah.
Now should we switch into externalization of voices?
Sure.
Okay.
Should we do that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Take over, because once you get a reduction in the first one, you want to make sure that's true at the gut level using a more aggressive technique, and then we can blow all of these out of the water. From a teaching point, some of the listeners may not be entirely convinced, and none of us is yet entirely convinced this is totally crushed. But people are saying, well, did that really happen? Is he just being nice to David and Jill? So now we're going to see if we can get the crunch at the gut level using an even more powerful technique.
All right, so that was the segment of the session for today. So, David, we stopped after the end of the paradoxical double standard technique, and you mentioned at the end of that tape segment that you're going to go into a very powerful technique called the externalization of voices, which we'll hear in the next episode. Can you say just a word or two as to what this is?
Yeah, externalization of voices is arguably the most powerful cognitive therapy technique ever developed, and it's one of the first ones I developed when I was going to Beck's seminars, and some of the early techniques that he had developed for cognitive therapy were good and interesting, but a little on the dry side, like examine the evidence, and the Socratic method, and things like that. Beautiful techniques, but kind of a little flat and boring sometimes to my way of thinking. And so I wanted to develop a powerful method that brought about change at the gut level, at the deepest possible level. And the externalization of voices has been my favorite technique over the years, and it's often combined with a technique called the acceptance paradox, which is really a way of achieving enlightenment, spiritual enlightenment through secular mechanisms. So people will hear that next week. I also want to say that this is a kind of a free but commercial type of undertaking, this podcasts, but it's really a very personal thing too. You're putting your heart in it, and I am too. This means a lot to us on a personal level, and many of you have responded in an overwhelming way to these podcasts, especially the recent series featuring live work with Mark. Many of you have said it's just touched your hearts in very meaningful ways. Many people have called me, actually, or emailed to say this is changing my life, people who are suffering from depression. It's been a very kind and strong response, and I wanted to thank everybody for that. If you're hearing it on Twitter or Facebook, I've switched to my new Facebook page.
Oh, yeah, you have this new, commercial Facebook page.
So I don't think it's called commercial, but it's like a business page.
Yeah, business page.
David D. Burns, MD, or David Burns, MD Facebook page. They'll all be posted there rather than my own personal Facebook page. And I don't respond to messages on Facebook. But if you want to contact me or comment on the podcast, put it on the comments section of the podcast at the bottom, or any blog, or email me through the website, and I respond to large numbers of those emails and comments. I just don't know how to respond to the Facebook email, and I get hundreds every day. I couldn't anyway. But if you'd like to, because I love hearing your personal comments.
And also we welcome questions, because now and then when we don't do a series like this one, we have those mini podcasts called Ask David, where we answer questions from the listeners.
Yeah, and we've had some tremendous questions lately, and I've answered a lot of them right away on the website, but I'm also saving some tremendous ones for our Ask David podcasts.
Yeah.
And lastly, just again, thank Jill's praises. What a pleasure to work with Jill. I feel like I'm working with one of the greatest therapists and teachers in the world.
Oh, yes. She's incredible. I agree.
Incredible.
I agree. All right. On to the next podcast. Thank you. This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this podcast under the blog page, and where you can leave your comments and questions. The website has an abundance of resources for therapists as well as non-therapists, including books, workshops, a list of online training groups around the world, and much more. Theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donsel. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.